Hi guys, welcome back. This week I'm going to do something that's a little bit different, a little bit out of the ordinary for what I normally do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a bit of a taste test on one of my beers. I'm going to do a beer review of sorts on somebody else's beer. Now that is quite unusual for me. I don't generally do that. And then I'm going to do a little bit of a comparison between them. But what I'm interested in is not really the similarity or difference of the beer, because they are quite different recipes, I think. I'm interested in the similarities of the yeast, because it's the same yeast. So what I'm hoping is, by tasting and looking at two different beers but two different brewers but using the same yeast, I'm kind of hoping I can maybe narrow down some of the traits of what I'm getting from the yeast out of this. Now, the way this came about was, if anyone's seen the yeast comparison I did on Mexican lager between Baja yeast and White Labs WLP 940, that came about because the head brewer of Doghead Brewing, this beer, got in contact with me and asked if I had tried the Baja yeast, because he was using it. I hadn't. I got hold of it, and I brewed my same beer with the two White Labs and Baja yeast, and then I did a taste comparison, and as it turned out, I wasn't hugely impressed with the Baja yeast. It was okay. It was a good beer in its own right, but it wasn't a patch on the liquid yeast from White Labs. Now, while I was in the process of that, I did a bit of reading across the internet to see what people were saying about it. And the rumor that's sort of going around is that Cellar Science Baja yeast may well be a repackaged AEB Fermolager crisp. As a coincidence then, Ron, the head brewer from Doghead, wrote back to me and said that he had moved to AEB Fermolager crisp and would I like to try some. Now, bear in mind, at the moment you can only get that in 500 gram packs, and I have no interest in 500 grams of yeast. He was kind enough to send me a couple of samples up so that I could brew with. So that's exactly what I've done. I've brewed my same Mexican lager again using the AEB yeast, and I'm going to compare it with his, and the hope is that I can see similarities and work out what it is that I'm getting out of the yeast. First, a quick rundown on the similarities that I think I've seen in the fermentation between this and Baja. Noticeably, Baja, I found there was quite a lag. I didn't really get a good start on the beer till about the 48-hour mark. Same with the AEB yeast. It took about 48 hours to really get up and running. Fermentation took a long time on both of the beers, and in fact this one I think is probably the longest fermentation I've possibly ever had. It just kept slowly ticking down, and I warmed it right up to well into D-rest temperatures. I sat it there for well over a week in the end, and eventually it did stop fermenting, but it took easily 5, possibly 6 weeks to really finish. Now, Ron said he didn't have that problem with his, but he was fermenting under pressure and raising the temperatures reasonably early. I don't do that. I just do a standard atmospheric pressure ferment. So that could have been a difference. On the Baja yeast, I think it was fairly temperature affected during the fermentation as well. So when I was fermenting that, I couldn't get the temperature controlled enough that I had a really cool fermentation, and I thought the beer was a little bit blunt. This one I've managed to get very good control on the temperature. I just did a full batch size in my normal system, so that doesn't feel quite as blunt as the Baja yeast did. Anyway, enough talk about that part of it. Let's get these open. What I'll do is I'll pour them both out, try and get a bit of a comparison to them, and then I'll have a taste of them. Right, this can's got a little bit of a ding in it. I've been here before with cans with dings in it. They sometimes can spray over, so I've got a towel ready and we'll see how this goes, but let's try it. Ah, good. Oh, no, not so good. Let's pour that in. So yeah, there's possibly the ding in the can has maybe got that razzed up a little bit, but not too bad. So that's good. And if we get an opener for this one, and if I just stand aside and get a little bit of a shot on that, you can see, and certainly if I put my hands behind them, you can see the clarity difference there, and you can see the color difference between the beers. He's definitely used a slightly different malt build to me to get that darker beer. Now, what do I know of his beer? I don't know a huge amount, but I do know a few things to start with. I know there's Vienna malt in it, and I'm pretty sure, and Pilsner malt from the website that I've read. I've also read that there is, I think, a squeeze of lime in it. It also says that he's using blue agave nectar, I think. So that'll add a little bit of taste, and possibly I think that might be where some of this colour is coming from. The other thing as well is quite important on this. He's dropped this to 3.4%. Now normally he's up closer to 4.5% and 5% mark on it, but this is an experiment, and one of the reasons he sent it to me is to see how the 3.4 has scaled down, and that's always an interesting experiment, an interesting operation, scaling down. So it's pretty clear. It's not bad. There is a slight haze to it. There's a little bit of yeast in suspension. I don't know that I can get a good shot on that. You probably can't really see it, but it's not bad. Pretty clear. That's good. There's a reasonable carbonation. There's lovely small bubbles coming off it, and it's just giving a nice foamy head to it. Okay, the first thing you get out of that is quite sweet. There's a real, almost fruity, sweet smell coming off that, and I'm going to say that's the agave. Okay, first thing you hit with is that sweetness that you can smell. Almost fruity, slightly florally. I don't know whether I'd quite go rose petally or whether I'm being led by the color a little bit, but lightly fruity, lightly sweet, and then it's quite lacking in the back end, and this is where the downgrade of percentage is coming in. Definitely, it's lacking a little bit of body. It's lacking malt backbone to it. It's quite clean. The fermentation's not bad. So from a yeast perspective, it is clean. It is It's reasonably crisp, I think, which, okay, that's good for the yeast, but there's a tartness to it. Tartness, astringency. Astringent is probably the wrong word. It's drying, slightly tart, and that's quite important, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. I'll come back to that part. I really don't know that I'm picking up the lime so much in that. If there's still lime in his recipe, maybe that might be part of the fruitiness. I'm not sure. Quite good as an idea. I see where that's going. I think it's just lacking in that low alcohol range, which is a shame. It's not balanced is the problem. It's too sweet as a lead-in straight away, and then the run out of the taste doesn't have that malt aftertaste, and possibly it'd be nice to see a little bit more lime in the aftertaste as well. But all in all, actually, as a beer, I see where that's going and where it should be, and as a higher alcohol percentage, I think yeah, that's probably quite a good beer. Right, contrasting with mine. Normally, I can smell quite strong lime coming from mine, which I'm not actually getting now. That's quite possibly the fruitiness, I think, of the Doghead Brew. And maybe there is lime in that, which is now knocking out the lime aroma in mine. But so instantly, more malt, more body. Yes, lime aftertaste. So thankfully that's coming back, it's strong enough. Now my lime is not from lime, it's from Motueka hops. And I've upped the percentage of this as well in the beer. Noticeably, this yeast seems to emphasize the bitterness of the hops, and it definitely knocks back the aroma and the fruitiness of late edition hops. Because with the White Labs yeast, the lime is really quite prominent in the aftertaste. Now I've upped this by 5% from my usual recipe, and it's still really subdued. But the bitterness is much stronger than when I do it with White Labs liquid Mexican yeast. And then that leads me on to that tartness, almost astringency, slightly dry, the same as the Doghead version is in mine. Now, I thought maybe it was a mashing problem I had initially. Then I thought maybe it was a temperature problem again, but there was no problem with the fermentation with temperature. I didn't have a mash pH problem. I double checked that at the time and it was good. So the fact that I get it in that beer also says to me that that is the yeast. Now that slight tartness, whatever it is that you want to call it, tannin, actually it's closer to almost tanniny is what it is. That doesn't come through using the liquid yeast. It's a much cleaner but very crisp finish to the White Labs liquid yeast, whereas in this and that, it's just this not quite, certainly not quite pleasant for me finish to it. It's a good beer. and it's a good beer in their own right, and the yeast produces a good beer. And don't get me wrong, as a backup yeast, if for whatever reason my starter went wrong on the day using my White Labs liquid yeast, I would happily enough put both the Baja and the Fermolager crisp into my beer, and I would be happy with the result I got out of that. But I know it's just not as good. In fact, I would go so far as to say I think it's not a patch on the liquid yeast. But I also understand the hassles of using a liquid yeast and building a starter and the time involved. So yes, I definitely see why you would go for a dry yeast. And I will continue probably looking at different versions of Mexican lager yeasts to find a good backup. At the moment, I think this is a good backup, but it won't replace the liquid yeast. I'll go back to his and try it. Yeah, definitely more malt required, and that it's really quite noticeable after drinking mine that's up around the 5% mark. To go to that, it is just lacking that second hit of something when you drink it. And it is malt. It needs that breadiness to follow through. So once that's tweaked, and I think he's going to take it back up to the higher alcohol. It was an interesting experiment, but definitely somewhere around the 5% mark is, and I think that's going to be a good beer. I'd be happy with that. But in its current guise, no, it's a little bit light, weak. I wouldn't go so far as to say watery by any means, but it needs tweaking. So that's been an interesting experiment for me today. You may or may not have got something out of it. I hope it helped with something. I hope you got something from it. Nonetheless, I've got free beer. I always like free beer, so that's good. I'm going to go out and drink in the sun to finish these. So until next time, life's good. Drink more beer.